And we're back. So this is the second talk of the 7th edition of the Legacy of Socrates, and I'm hosting now EsterDaniel Ytterbrink, who is a software developer with a love for patterns, and they have a background in behavioral science and an interest in interior design, which is what we're going to talk about. I found the analogy very interesting between interior design and legacy code. We're discussing that on the backstage with EsterDaniel and Adi. And it's quite interesting, like just like stubbing your toe on some bureau that is malplaced is really painful. How this software is architecture can make a difference on your life. Like you're spending a lot of your time working, living in that code base, so to speak. So EsterDaniel has some thought about that, and I'm gonna also drop the link to their blog, Chocolate Driven Development, which is an awesome name for a blog, in the chat. And yeah, so without further ado, EsterDaniel, you're up.
Thank you very much. On the blog, there will also, when this conference is over, be a post with links that you might be interested in regarding this talk. So you don't really have to try to remember things. It will all be there. Don't be stressed if there's too much information. You will be able to get back to it later. So yes, I'm EsterDaniel. I'm here to talk about software interior design and how to limit cognitive waste when writing code. And I have a plan for this. First, I'm going to talk briefly about interior design, what it means to me, why I think it's useful in this analogy. Then we're going to take a short detour to Livable Code by Sarah May. Then I'm going to bring up the aspects of cognition that I think is useful to know about, to then end in software and how we can use software interior design to limit cognitive waste. Interior design, how to pick your curtains. Or can it be more? In the late 40s and early 50s in Sweden, it was definitely more. Sweden was going to build a lot of houses because we were short in housing. And to make sure that the kitchens there were safe, ergonomic, and efficient, they started a research institute to research kitchens. They found out that a normal housewife traveled about 7 kilometers every day just inside the home. And it was mostly like forwards and backwards in the kitchen. So by figuring all these things out and looking at the biomechanics of the body, they could build a better and safer kitchen. And that was also more efficient. And that makes older kitchens in Sweden still very appreciated, also when it comes more trendy kitchens that compete with them. Because for me, interior design is about function. I guess that there are a few of you who tried to fit another desk into a room that was already crowded to be able to work from home, and that is not always a really good idea. We also figured out that ergonomics is important, and even though it's also nice to have a pleasant home with colors also make us perceive the room differently, and lighting is also important for the function of the home. So there's a lot more to it than sofa cushions and drapes. As a tool to design things, those who work with physical objects have something called natural affordance. This door wants to be pulled. If you see a ring, your instinct is to pull it. So if you want to have a door to be pulled, you put a ring on it. If you want to interact with the door in some other way, there are other handles. Just doors, they are a really good example for natural affordance because it becomes so obvious when it's not intuitive what to do with the door. But this can be used in other areas as well. Buttons want to be pushed, levers want to be pulled. You have a dial, you try to turn it. And if you have a windowsill that can't support the full weight of a grown-up person, then you shouldn't put cushions on it. Perhaps place a cactus instead. So yeah, natural affordance is building objects so that the instinctual way to interact with them is also the correct way. It can, of course, also be used with digital interfaces, and both Google and Apple has done a lot around this. And I think we can use it in software as well, as I will come to later. When we don't have natural affordance to use, we can use standards. I bet that most of you know what these symbols mean, even though they have nothing to do with humans on the savannah hundreds of thousands of years ago. Instead, we pick them up somewhere when we grew up, and then since they are used consistently, we trust their use. Software interior design can also be used for behavior change. If we have hangers that are in the height of kids in our hallway, it's more likely for the kids to hang up their coat than drop it on the floor, hopefully. At least they wouldn't hang it up if they had nothing to hang it on. We can design our space so that it's easier to put things away than to bring them out, because it will make it tidier. This is a Marie Kondo folded clothes drawer. If you're familiar with the KonMari method from Marie Kondo, it comes from her book, The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And in this context, I think that life-changing is the important part. It builds on a concept of joy sparking. So I want you to think of the item that you love the most, your most prized possession, how you treat it, how you feel when you touch it, and how well you care for it. The KonMari method tells you to only keep things that spark joy in you, and then by cleaning out everything else, you have space enough in your home to actually care for the things that you keep. And she also says that once you clean your house this way, it will never be untidy again. I haven't managed, but I like her idea, and she says that it's because something in you click. You change as a person when you realize that you can have a tidy home, and the cost of bringing in things in your home that you don't love will stop us from shopping and buying things that we don't want in our home that only crowds it. So by changing the way that we look at things around us, we can actually change our behavior in a way that makes it easier for us to have a tidy life and a tidy home. And this about behavioral change and how we can make a permanent difference is something that I would want to bring with me into software interior design as well. And that leads me to Sarah May and the lovely talk about livable code. When I published my blog post about software interior design, and later when I attended the podcast Legacy Code Rocks and talked about software interior design, people sent me links of this talk by Sarah May that is also linked in my blog post on livable code. And I think it's a really good talk. I am pretty sure that I watched it before I wrote the text on software interior design. And I suggest that you go and see it. But I also think that software interior design is something different than livable code. And to see what I want to build upon the concept of livable code, I have to introduce it shortly. And Sarah May, in her presentation on livable code, one of the parts that she talks about is that we should think of our code base as our working environment. This is where we do our work. So just as we care for our living space or our office, we tidy up, we collaborate with others, we take care of our things together, we decide when to clean and when to reorganize. We should also care about our code and do it together and make sure that it doesn't end up in a terrible mess. But she talks mostly about that we should constantly tidy after ourselves, like this Sisyphus work of cleaning a home. I want to add the layer of research, just as with biomechanics and some psychology and cognition when we do interior design in our homes, in our public spaces. We use knowledge about how most people work, or all people work, or how those who need adaptation the most work to build a more functional space. I want us to use the knowledge that we have about how people work in a code base, how cognition for people work, to make decisions that are best for most of us, because we're all human. So I think the basic from livable code is really, really important, but I want to add this strategic level of using cognition to figure out where the traps, where we might lose cognitive energy lies, so that we can eliminate them. So then we need to talk about cognition, right? Cognition is thinking, and it's a wide subject. I want to focus on the inconsistency of our quality of thinking. Just because I don't perform evenly through the day. Most people don't. Most people get tired and hungry, and somehow it seems to depend on what we do. So we have this energy pool of some kind that is drained from a group of activities that we do. And here I have a challenge for you. I want you to help me to find a name for this, because I've tried, I've searched, I've used marbles in another talk to explain something that is taken away and that can be depleted. Ego depletion is used for the state where we have too little of this to make proper decisions. But I don't have a really good name for this cognitive, emotional energy unit that is also vaguely related to sugar, which I will come to in a minute. So while you're thinking of this, while listening to me, please see if you can help me find a good word that would make explaining this much easier next time I try. Anyway, now we're starting. Cognition, problem solving. That's what we think of when we think of cognition. And I would say that that's the goal of software development. We want to solve problems. So I would say that everything that is not problem solving is waste. Something closely related to problem solving is decoding, figuring out letters, putting them together as words, but also bigger pictures, concepts. How does this actually work? That is decoding. Something also related to problem solving is deciding. Decision fatigue is another word for ego depletion. It's when we made so many decisions that we can't really make any useful decisions anymore. And that is why a lot of people with power or influence tend to have a monotonous wardrobe, so that they don't have to spend any of these choices in the morning when picking out clothes. It also seemed to be related to resisting and making good choices, or choices expected of us. Researchers took a group of people, divided them into two. One group had to remember a set of digits. Another group had to remember more digits. The one who had to remember more digits were more likely to, when afterwards they were offered a snack, pick the cake over the fruit, whereas the one who had to remember less digits were more likely to pick the fruit. And I mean, know that this is in a context where fruit is supposed to be good and cake is supposed to be bad. I don't know if I agree with that always. But what the research tries to show is that we are more easily tempted, especially with sugars, when we have performed the cognitive work of remembering digits. It also seemed to be related to blood sugar in general. They looked at judges who were testing appeals. And the default decision for an appeal is to decline it. And before lunch, there was a higher percentage of declines than after lunch. So hungry judges tended to go to the default decision, where when they had eaten, it was more of a actual decision, looking at the facts and deciding something. It also has to do with behaving and controlling yourself. They had dogs where some got to do whatever they wanted, play around, and some had to sit. And afterwards, all of them got this dog toy with a treat in it, and they timed how long they had energy to play with it. And even though the sitting dogs hadn't moved, they had less energy left to play with the toy. And what the researchers think from this is that it took energy from the dogs to take orders and do as they were told. And it also interacts with that it takes this kind of energy is also drained from navigating social relationships. There's a word for being angry because you're hungry, and it's called hangry. I think it's a good word to have. It happens to me a lot. But there's also research saying that when a person's values are not correlating with the organization's values where they work, they are at a higher risk of burnout. So somehow, these things that we do to be able to stay around the campfire at night, because that's what we're optimized for in the savannah, they also take from this pool of energy that I hope that you will name for me. So yeah, all of those things are aspects of cognition that I think is important for limiting cognitive waste when writing software. So how do we apply this? Firstly, I did this into 3 areas: decoding, deciding, and social. So we will start with the decoding. Minimize lines read is my short version of limiting cognitive waste when decoding. And we can do this in a lot of ways. We can remove noise. You have a version control system, I hope. Use that. Remove code that you don't use. Dead code that is commented out, just delete it. You will be able to find it later. I promise. It's still there somewhere, but it won't be in your way. Add structure. If you have a heap of books and you add a bookshelf, it won't really feel as if you added something. It will feel as if you removed something. And I think it's the same thing with software. By using patterns and grouping code, there's a lot on how to do it, but I think the main thing is to remember that adding structure, even though it might add lines, it might add files, it might add a lot of things that seems to be making things more, it could actually make it feel like less. Especially if you name things properly. There's a lot of work done on naming. I'll be linking one of the articles that I find useful in my blog post with the 7 stages of naming, where you go from something that doesn't make sense to something that is brutally honest, and then you work your way to something that it actually what it does. So by naming things properly and putting them into boxes, we will have to read less. I also think that we have natural affordance in our code base, and that we all have the equivalent of pull written in black marker somewhere in our code. But if we can work with things like naming methods, using dependency injection, I think is underestimated as a communicator. Often it's used to make things more loosely coupled or easier to test or things like that. But I also think that it's very useful to have a method signature or a constructor of an object that actually shows what this thing collaborates with, and that is typed in a way that we want to use it correctly. I think that a lot of design patterns can be translated to natural affordance in software. Abstraction. I was very happy to see that there will be a talk on hexagonal design today. This is hexagons. I love hexagons also when crafting. Joe Rainsberger, that I think you've also had on this conference, tweeted that it's hard to make software developers know the, and I need to have the difference between abstraction and indirection. And I think, as I tweeted him today, that how it makes us feel about wanting to read more or less code could be a hint if we're doing abstraction or only indirection. Because if we have a distraction, we feel safe in not reading the code beyond our box. But if we're only adding indirection, we will want to follow its trace to read more lines so that we can feel safe. And Laura talked about familiarity. I love that. Not adding things that will give other people's headache just to try something new. I think that's a general rule. Sarah May talks about that it's important not to sacrifice improvement over consistency. And I think that could also be true if improvement is important and you can fix the cognitive load that it gives some other way, but don't add diversity for diversity's sake in codebase. Otherwise, do add it. But in codebases and pipelines, and where we're going to process things, patterns, and making things the same shape is good. Because there's research on chess players and memorizing chessboards that shows that if you just add random pieces on a chessboard, chess players are worse at remembering them than just a random person. But if it's a chessboard that resulted from an actual game, the chess players are much better at remembering a complex board than a random person. So use the patterns that we have to limit cognitive load. This is also the case for using diceware as passwords. I like to have word passwords, like random words, and then you need one word per 2 random characters to get the same security. But to me, it's much easier to remember 4 words than 8 characters, because I can do things with the words in my mind to make them make sense in a way that it's harder with characters. So use all those things also in your code base. Patterns, ways to be familiar with the code. Avoid surprises. Adam Thornhill talks about this in his really good book, Software Design X-rays, when he looks at version control data to understand code better. And I think it's a general rule. You don't want surprises from your code. I would go farther and say that you don't want toys either, but that chocolate is good. Anyway, so side effects where they're not supposed to be is a surprise, as I see it. Getting the users shouldn't send emails to them. Real life example. So avoid examples, and that is tightly coupled to the next part that is about pain and fear. A software developer, okay, I'm going to be fast. A software developer has experienced pain from the code base. Perhaps a really bad surprise or a nasty consequence that that made them break something in a bad way or had other sad consequences, will make them afraid of the code base, and perhaps afraid of other code bases later as well. And I think that a sign of a developer who's afraid is that they optimize for lines read per minute. And if you want to read as many lines as possible per minute, you don't want to break things up. So then you have the added cognitive load of not having any structure, because you don't trust the code that you don't read, that it will work. So try to make a code base where there's not so many bad consequences if you mess up. And there I think tests is a good thing, because if you have a test frame around your code base, even though it's just checking the main things that it's working, or if there's a way to add tests easily before you change things, it will be much less scary to change it, because you will see where something explodes or not. So I think that one way to say why tests is good is because it makes you less afraid to change things in the code, and then you don't have to read that much code, and then you can use that decoding energy for other things. So deciding. Choices are expensive. I love standards. Any standard is better than no standard. So even if it has to be a really, really bad standard, if it should be better than no standard. So coding style, configuration as code, all of that, if you can write it down so that you don't have to make decisions each time you're trying something or each time you format a file, I would say go for it. In JavaScript, there's even a standard called standard, and I like that. And if you have a standard and you can automate it, do it. No one should have to think about code formatting in their code reviews. Everyone's time is more important than spending it on formatting. And configuration is code. Lovely, as we already heard from the previous presentation. And if you have standards, you've automated it, it will also, as we heard, spare you from reinventing the wheel. So every decision that you can reuse is a saved decision. And that's also if you use someone else's software. There's tons of decisions in that you don't have to make. And you should be happy for every decision that can be spared you. And the thing with both standards and automation is that they can be renegotiated. But I will talk about that later. Here, for example, because the third part is often forgotten, and that is how we interact with each other, and that matters for the quality of the code. Because if we drain our cognitive resources by navigating the team or the company, that will affect the code quality. And that's where that's why I would say that one of the benefits with code as a configuration as code, is that they are social contracts. If I set up a new server and there's a script for me to do it, I won't have to be afraid that I forgot some part of the firewall. And if we have a linter that is run before every push, I won't have to think about getting comments on that in my code review. If we want to renegotiate those social contracts, we can do it, but then it will be deliberate. We will say, okay, we're going to use this time and this energy and those cognitive resources that could be used for problem solving and figure out if we need another linting rule. And if we think that makes sense, we can do so. But if not, as Laura mentioned, weigh your costs. And this might be a bit controversial, But I want to talk about eating. And I'm not going to tell you what not to eat. I'm not going to tell you what to eat. I'm going to tell you not to shame others for what they eat. Because if something you say or your body language make your colleague not eat what they feel that they need, even if it's a chocolate bar and you know they skipped lunch, then that will affect the quality of your code. If people want to diet for their own sake, I think they should be allowed to. But everything that we do to make ourselves work properly, even if it's taking a nap on the sofa, taking a walk around the block, and in the diet culture that we exist in, some more than others, eating, I think we should help each other as a team to make sure that we get what we think that we need, and be aware that the pressure on people to have a specific body or figure or think about what they eat is different. So there's a privilege. If you've never doubted if you should put that candy in your mouth, that is a privilege that not everyone has. And lastly, but not leastly, this is also related to privilege, hedonic balance. Hedonic comes from Greek and it means pleasure. And it comes originally from marriage research. And it's the balance between positive and negative interactions in a conversation. For example, it can be words, but also body language. And even though it comes from marriage research, it has also been researched in pair programming. And it has been shown that measuring the hedonic balance for the first 5 minutes of a pair programming session can predict the end result. And the best result is for a hedonic balance that is mutual, that is regulated. So if you have a regulated hedonic balance, both parties or all parties give more positive input to the interaction than negative. So think about this in your team. Who lifts the burden of making sure that the conversation is nice and the climate is pleasant and that nobody gets angry? Do you have one person that is allowed to take a lot of space and never accommodate the other's needs or emotions? In that case, the person who takes too much space, or the people to take more responsibility than the others, these things will affect their ability to perform when it comes to problem solving. So if there's one person taking responsibility for the feelings of the entire team, there will be less energy left for this person to solve problems and look clever and be promoted. And if it's the same person who's refused the cookie in the afternoon because they feel ashamed to eat, because they think they shouldn't, then that's actually quite bad for them. So on that end note, perhaps a bit solemn, if you don't remember anything from this presentation, I want you to remember to consider the cognitive cost when you make decisions, both when it comes to the code base and how you interact with each other and the processes you build. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a lot to unpack here. So again, I will leave people a couple of minutes to drop questions. Drop your questions in the Ask a Question box.
And if audio disappears as you do, refresh.
Yes. And I do have something in the chat for you, EsterDaniel. Mm-hmm. So you were asking for suggestions for names. So yes. I got two. Uh-huh. The first one is a gumption trap. I will send you a link, but basically it's in the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. There is this notion of event or mindset that will cause the person to lose enthusiasm and become discouraged for continuing or starting a project. So there is this to dig into, and also Jim is suggesting cognitive token bucket, like you have a bucket of limited token, and yeah, it's a limited resource.
Yeah, I like that. The one objection I have is that some of the things that I read recently says that it's more about emotions actually than cognitive. So I would like to have the emotions part in there somehow, because there's some research hinting on that what we actually do when we make decisions is pushing our emotions around and try to get the right emotion to win.
Yeah. So like when you're like when you're stressed out because there's a deadline coming close, and then you lose your temper with everything, with everyone.
Yeah.
To actually take a break.
Or when you know that you perhaps would feel better if you did a workout now, but the sofa is nice. And then to get you out to the door, you might think about, it would feel very good to be able to post a proud selfie on the internet after this. And you like feel that pride in you beforehand. And that is the thing that makes you go out through the door.
Yes. And that reminds me a lot about Atomic Habits from James Clear, which is talking a lot about how your brain is working and how you can, I don't want to say treat yourself, but more like help
reward yourself. Because
reward yourself.
Because the things we did on the savannah, they rewarded us instantly. So our brain is built to be rewarded instantly. So we have to reward ourselves if we want to move ourselves in a certain direction. And it's exactly things like that make me think that it should not only be cognition in this bucket, it's something else as well. But otherwise, the token and the bucket is awesome. Perhaps add something to emotion and cognition. Token bucket is very long, but yeah. I'm glad that I got suggestions.
So, yeah, you got suggestions in the chat, and someone mentioned it, and your talk also reminded me of this, which I haven't read yet, and of course, so I need to unlock the zoom with the blur. But basically, it's the programmer's brain from Felian Hermans, which I received recently. She published that at the end of the summer, and she is talking a lot about the things you are also referring to, like how your brain is working and the cognitive aspect to interacting with the code. And yeah, I think that is a great compliment to what you're saying.
I'm going to read it.
And I didn't read it yet, but I know that Guillaume in the chat mentioned it, so I figured I should mention it too.
I'm going to read the chat next break as well.
Yeah, there are a few things to unpack here. Thank you very much. I don't see any questions so far.
I want questions.
I think that was really, really interesting. I do have one question, which is so usually when you're working in this code base, often you're not alone working with that, and I'm wondering if you have some suggestions or ideas to make others also go in that direction of making the code base a better place to live in, etc. So not just impacting you, but also bringing others.
Yeah, I think that one of the important parts there is to make people feel safe. So that you don't try to make people do something that they're not really good at, because often that can make people protective. And so if there's a new skill that you need to learn, make sure that the people can get that skill in a comfortable way, so that they don't get defensive. And I mean, if it's people that you can like explain things to, it's awesome. Sometimes it might just be that they're not aware of what they're doing or why they're doing it. I also believe in the Marie Kondo shift of understanding what is available to you. I believe that there are a lot of developers out there who's never seen a good code base. I mean, most of the code that they worked in was so bad that they can't even imagine how it could be to work in a good code base. And that the code base that they've seen that is good is, it's like small hobby projects or example sites. They are not realistic. So that could be a part to show people good working code that is realistically big, or how you could actually make changes in the existing code base to make it drastically better. And I think that has to be done collaboratively. You cannot tell someone change this. You have to show them how to do it, and practice. Perhaps tidy up a corner and make that feel really, really good. I remember the first time I got to do a part of the code test driven, and the result and how that could be then moved around in the other code part of it. Had to be moved after a while to another part of the system because we changed what interacted with it. And it was just like, take it out and drop it down, and it worked because it was like isolated and it was tested and everybody knew that it would work. It was a tiny thing, nothing complicated, so nothing like genius, but I got to drive it by test, and then I could show the rest of the team what happens if you do that, and if you have an isolated part that can be taken out and put back somewhere else and it works. So yeah, was that an answer to your question?
Yeah, well, that does. You actually bring a lot of points, like having people read code, having them feel safe, also showing by example on small part of the code base. Like all of this can help your team understand and maybe overcome the blockers. And I have a follow-up question from Jim in the chat. And we will end on this, which is, okay, besides the team, what about management? Like the people who are not spending their time in the code base, and how do you convince them about the benefits of interior design, which they cannot see and experiment?
I think that the good thing that it's something that goes under the radar. If you think that architecture is this big and grand things that management care about, interior design is something that they don't really have to know about. I think if we can figure out a way to get the time to do it right without them knowing about it, that's the best. Because, I mean, they want you to flush when you go to the toilet, right? Even though it takes a couple of seconds extra. It's that kind of basic hygiene, actually, even though we don't think about it like that.
That's an amazing example. But yeah, basically the idea here is that don't ask permission to refactor. And of course, to do that, if refactoring means that you will spend 2 weeks just doing refactorings and not shipping anything, they will notice. But there are ways to improve the place progressively through time, and still deliver value at the same time.
And a lot of these things are things that don't require big refactorings. It's like breaking up something small, breaking up something into 2 chunks, or renaming something, or cleaning up, removing some commented code that nobody cares about. I mean, it doesn't have to take weeks. It can take like 1 minute.
Yeah, refactor as you go, and talk with your team to make the code a better place, and make standards explicit. I got that from your presentation. Standards. Yeah. All right. I think we're good with the questions. So thank you very much again. again, the talk was recorded, so you will be able to share that talk with your teammates, and anyone who would be interested in that. And we will put the links to EsterDaniel's blog, Chocolate Driven Development, in the YouTube description. And now we're going to take a little break.
My email is there as well if you want to contact me.
Yes.
That's safer than Twitter.
Okay. Good to know. So yeah. We'll put all of that in the description so people can reach out to you. Great. Thank you very much. Let's see each other after a break. Bye-bye.